October 2nd, 1918. A heavy fog settles over the Argonne Forest in northeastern France. The air smells of wet soil, cordite, and blood. Somewhere deep in that labyrinth of mud and trees, more than 550 American soldiers vanish. Not in a single night, not to enemy fire alone. They vanish because of something far more complex, a mixture of courage, confusion, and command failure that would echo through U.S. military history for a century. This is the story of the Lost Battalion. But history would come to call it something else, the Forgotten Battalion, because what happened next was so unbelievable, so wrapped in chaos, that for years, no one wanted to talk about it again. The Argonne Offensive was the largest operation ever mounted by the American Expeditionary Forces in World War I. Over 1.2 million U.S. troops were ordered to push the Germans back from their fortified positions along a 47-mile front. General John J. Pershing's plan was simple, on paper. Break through the German lines, cut off their supply routes, and force a surrender before winter. But on the ground, it was a nightmare. Dense forests, poor maps, enemy artillery hidden in the hills, and orders that changed by the hour. Among those troops was a mixed unit drawn from New York's 77th Division, known as the Metropolitan Division, because most of its men came from New York City. Shopkeepers, dock workers, immigrants, Italian, Irish, Jewish, Polish, men who spoke a dozen languages but shared one dream: to go home alive. They were led by Major Charles W. Whittlesey, a quiet lawyer from Massachusetts who had volunteered in 1917. He wasn't a career soldier. He wasn't looking for glory. But by the end of this story, his name would be carved into history, and his soul shattered by it. The advance. On the morning of October 2nd, 1918, Whittlesey received an order from Division Command: advance through the Argonne Forest and seize the high ground beyond the Charlevoix Ravine. He was told that friendly units were on both his left and right. They weren't. Unaware that other units had been stalled or forced back by heavy German resistance, Whittlesey's men pushed forward, 554 soldiers in all, through tangled woods, under sporadic machine gun fire. By nightfall, they had reached their objective, a small patch of hillside deep in enemy territory. They dug in, exhausted but proud. Then the Germans closed the trap. Encircled. By dawn on October 3rd, Whittlesey realized something was wrong. There was no contact with either flank. No runners returned. The promised artillery support never came. His battalion was surrounded completely. German forces had slipped behind them, sealing every route of retreat. Soon, snipers picked off anyone who moved beyond the shallow trenches. Ammunition began to run low. Rations were nearly gone. And still, the orders were clear: hold your position. The first shells. By mid-morning, American artillery finally began to fire, but the shells were landing on the wrong coordinates. Whittlesey's men were being shelled by their own side. Panic swept through the ravine. Men screamed for cover as trees exploded overhead, showering splinters and dirt. The only way to stop it was to send a message back through the lines, but every runner who tried was shot before he got 50 yards. Finally, Whittlesey turned to his last option, a homing pigeon named Cher Ami. Pinned down under enemy fire, a sergeant wrote the desperate note: "We are along the road parallel to 276.4. Our own artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it." They tied the note to Cher Ami's leg and released her into the smoky sky. German snipers spotted the bird instantly, a moving speck of hope, and opened fire. Bullets tore through her feathers. One eye was destroyed, one leg nearly severed. But Cher Ami flew, 25 miles, through rain, smoke, and shell fire. She made it. The barrage stopped. A fragile hope. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the German voices began to echo through the forest. "Amerikaner," they shouted. "You are surrounded. Surrender now." Whittlesey stood up in the trench, mud clinging to his uniform. He said nothing. He looked at his men, dirty, bleeding, half-starved. Some were clutching Bibles, others were just staring into the trees. He turned to his officers and said quietly, "We don't surrender." That night, German soldiers crept close enough to toss food and leaflets over the ridge, a strange mix of mockery and mercy. The leaflets promised good treatment if they gave up. No one moved. The fifth day. By the fifth day, October 6th, the situation had become hellish. The wounded were dying from exposure. The living were drinking from muddy puddles. Whittlesey's men were eating leaves, scraping dew from rocks. Flies swarmed over corpses they couldn't bury. Of the 554 who went in, only a fraction were still able to fight. And yet, when German troops launched another assault, they held their ground, with bayonets, with fists, with the last bullets they had. When reinforcements finally broke through the German lines on October 7th, what they found in the ravine was beyond belief. Of the 554 who entered the forest, only 194 walked out. The rest were dead, missing, or captured. Whittlesey, hollow-eyed and silent, refused to talk to reporters. He received the Medal of Honor, but he never celebrated it.
3 years later, aboard a ship returning from a veterans event, Major Whittlesey walked to the deck in the middle of the night and jumped into the ocean. Closing lines, Part 1. The U.S. Army called it a victory, but history, with all its ironies, called it something else, the Lost Battalion. Yet for decades, their story faded into the noise of bigger wars and louder heroes. The men of the 77th were immigrants, factory workers, forgotten faces. Their bravery didn't fit the clean narrative of American triumph. But in the mud of the Argonne, amid fog, fire, and death, they had held their ground, alone, unseen, and unbreakable. October 8, 1918, dawn. The mist in the Argonne Forest hung thick, curling around shattered trees and broken bodies. The firing had stopped, but silence in war can be more frightening than noise. American soldiers from nearby regiments began to move cautiously into the ravine, calling out through the fog, "Any survivors? Is anyone alive?" And then faint voices answered, from holes in the earth, from behind fallen logs, from among the dead. They emerged like ghosts, some limping, some blind from gas burns, some carrying their wounded brothers on makeshift stretchers. One private, his hands shaking, whispered, "We thought the world forgot us." The rescue. What rescuers found was horrifying. Corpses lay intertwined in trenches barely 2 feet deep, bodies bloated by rain, faces unrecognizable. The wounded stared vacantly, beyond pain. Major Whittlesey stood amid the wreckage, his uniform torn, his boots filled with mud and blood. He didn't speak. He simply saluted the stretcher bearers as they passed. Reporters were already on the way. Someone back at headquarters had called it a miracle of endurance. But to the men who had lived it, there was nothing miraculous about what they saw around them. The headlines. Within days, newspapers across the United States carried triumphant headlines. The Lost Battalion found. American heroes defy the Kaiser. Yanks hold ground against impossible odds. Photos of Whittlesey and his officers were printed in every major paper. He was called the hero of the Argonne. Children in New York collected pennies to send to the survivors. Broadway wrote songs about them. But behind the headlines, a quieter truth was emerging, and it was far more complicated. The numbers game. When the official report came out, it listed 107 dead, 63 missing, 190 wounded, and 194 survivors. But veterans of the battalion would later claim those numbers didn't tell the full story. Dozens of men had been miscounted, buried in unmarked graves, or listed as deserters because no one could identify their bodies. Some survivors were left untreated for weeks, their records lost or falsified. The government needed heroes, not statistics. The narrative had to be clean, a brave stand, a dramatic rescue, a symbol of American spirit. The chaos, the friendly fire, the confusion in command that led them into that death trap, those details were quietly erased. The homecoming. When Whittlesey and a few of his men returned to New York in late 1918, the city erupted in celebration. Parades thundered down Fifth Avenue. Banners read, "Welcome home, heroes." Bands played patriotic marches. But as the confetti fell, many of those men stared blankly ahead, their minds still trapped in the ravine. They had survived the war, but not the memories. Private Abraham Krotoszenski, a Polish immigrant who had volunteered to sneak through enemy lines to get help, was decorated for bravery, but he couldn't sleep without nightmares of crawling over dead bodies. Lieutenant Leake, one of Whittlesey's close officers, never spoke publicly about what he saw again. He moved west and lived quietly, changing towns often, as if trying to outrun the forest. And Whittlesey, the man the press had crowned a hero, was dying a little each day. The Medal of Honor. In December 1918, Major Charles Whittlesey stood in Washington, D.C., before a cheering crowd. He wore his uniform, pressed and clean, his eyes hollow from insomnia. General Pershing pinned the Medal of Honor to his chest. Applause roared, flashbulbs popped, and when reporters asked how he felt, Whittlesey said softly, "There was no heroism. We simply did what soldiers do. We held our position." He smiled politely, but he never wore the medal again.
The War Within. Over the next 3 years, Whittlesey tried to return to normal life. He reopened his law office in New York, attended veterans events, and spoke at memorials for fallen soldiers. But something in him had changed. He flinched at loud noises. He avoided crowds. He couldn't bear the sound of fireworks. Letters from families of the dead poured in, hundreds of them, each one asking what had happened to their son, their brother, their husband. He answered every letter, every single one, even when he didn't know the truth. In one, he wrote, "Your boy was brave beyond words. He died facing the enemy." But in his private notes found years later, he had written, "I saw him die in my arms. I told him help was coming. It never did." The Journey. November 1921. Aboard the SS Toloa, a passenger ship bound for Havana. Whittlesey was traveling to attend a reunion of veterans and diplomats, a goodwill mission, they called it. He stood quietly on the deck that night, watching the ocean churn beneath the moonlight. In his cabin, he left several envelopes on the desk, one for his law partner, one for a friend, and one for the U.S. Army. When the ship reached Havana the next morning, Major Charles Whittlesey was gone. The note he left behind simply read, "I am tired." Aftermath. His body was never found. Newspapers called it a tragedy of nerves, a hero's burden. But for the men of the 77th Division, it felt like losing him all over again. At the annual reunion the next year, a survivor stood up and said, "The war took him in 1918. It just waited 3 years to finish the job." Legacy. Today, deep in the Argonne Forest, a stone monument stands where the battalion made its last stand. Few tourists visit it. Moss covers the engravings. The wind whispers through the trees like the ghosts of the fallen. And yet, for those who know the story, the air feels heavier there, as if the forest itself remembers. More than a century later, the Lost Battalion remains a symbol of courage and confusion, sacrifice and silence. Their stand changed nothing in the grand strategy of the war, and yet it changed everything about what it means to be forgotten by history and still hold your ground. November 1918. The guns had fallen silent. Europe was a landscape of mud, smoke, and graves. But even as peace was declared, a quieter war began. not in the trenches, but in the corridors of military offices and government archives. For the story of the Lost Battalion was not just one of bravery and endurance. It was also a story of bureaucratic failure, censorship, and betrayal. And those who tried to speak the truth soon discovered that some battles never end. The Classified Report. In February 1919, deep inside an American military archive in Chalon-sur-Marne, France, an internal review began. Its title read, Operation Argonne, Sector C, Report Classified, for command eyes only. The investigation sought to answer one simple question. How did a battalion of the 77th Division end up surrounded and abandoned in enemy territory? Was it miscommunication, faulty orders, or a deliberate cover-up? No one could agree, and within weeks, the report was sealed and hidden from public view. The letter that never made it. In March 1920, a former postal clerk who had served in the Army wrote a letter to the New York Tribune. He claimed, I personally carried documents from the Argonne files. I saw the communications log of the 77th Division removed. The words friendly fire were deleted from the report. The letter was never published. The Tribune's editor later admitted that official pressure had been applied from Washington. The silenced witnesses. Several surviving soldiers from the Lost Battalion attempted to testify publicly, to tell how their own artillery had shelled them, how they starved for days, chewing on roots and bark to survive. But one by one, each was labeled mentally unfit or placed on medical leave. Their voices were dismissed. Some were told, "You are heroes, don't tarnish your own legend." And so they went silent. The article that disappeared. In 1921, a prominent New York newspaper planned a feature story on Major Whittlesey and his men. Photographs were taken, interviews conducted, a tribute to their sacrifice. Days before publication, a call came from the War Department. The editor was advised, to preserve the morale of the nation, some stories are best forgotten. The article vanished. So did the negatives. The Argonne Box. In 1935, a French farmer clearing land in the Argonne Forest uncovered a rusted metal box. Inside were letters, maps, and faded photographs. One map showed something shocking, the precise artillery grid of the American guns firing directly onto the coordinates of the 77th Battalion's position. The friendly fire theory was no longer a rumor. It was written in ink and coordinates. But soon after, the box was lost from a local French archive. Only one photograph remained, a copy the farmer's son had made. He donated it to the Smithsonian Museum in 1962. Erased from the record. In the 1950s, a declassified Pentagon document titled Argonne Action Reports Volume 4 was released to the public. Whittlesey's name was missing. The phrase Lost Battalion had been replaced by Frontline Patrol Minor Engagement. A quiet rewriting of history. A deliberate act of forgetting. The Argonne Box. In 1935, a French farmer clearing land in the Argonne Forest uncovered a rusted metal box. Inside were letters, maps, and faded photographs. One map showed something shocking, the precise artillery grid of the American guns firing directly onto the coordinates of the 77th Battalion's position. The friendly fire theory was no longer a rumor. It was written in ink and coordinates. But soon after, the box was lost from a local French archive. Only one photograph remained, a copy the farmer's son had made. He donated it to the Smithsonian Museum in 1962. Erased from the record. In the 1950s, a declassified Pentagon document titled Argonne Action Reports Volume 4 was released to the public. Whittlesey's name was missing. The phrase Lost Battalion had been replaced by Frontline Patrol Minor Engagement. A quiet rewriting of history. A deliberate act of forgetting.
The final battle, inside the mind. Historians later agreed Whittlesey's death was not simply the result of exhaustion. It was the slow collapse of a man forced to carry the unbearable weight of truth. He knew that his men had died because of the mistakes of their own command. He knew the records had been altered, but he was told, "For the sake of national pride, you will say nothing." And so, in silence, he fought his last war, a war against his conscience. Aftermath. To this day, the full story of the Lost Battalion remains hidden in redacted pages. The official version speaks of valor, but the ground beneath the Argonne still whispers of confusion, miscommunication, and sacrifice beyond imagination. They were soldiers abandoned, yet they stood their ground. They were forgotten, yet they became immortal. And though Whittlesey's name fades from memory, the forest remembers. Every gust of wind through its ravines still carries the echo of his last command. "We will hold, we will not surrender." The war was over. But for the men who had lived through the Argonne, peace was only another battlefield. When they came home, there were no parades, no medals pinned in grand halls. There was only silence and the endless noise inside their own minds. The homecoming that never happened. In April 19, ships carrying the survivors of the 77th Division arrived at Hoboken, New Jersey. New York City, their city, was only a ferry ride away. They expected brass bands, family, flags. Instead, they were told to disembark quietly. There were too many arrivals that week. The crowds had moved on. The armistice celebrations were long over. One soldier wrote in his diary, "We fought like ghosts, and we returned as ghosts. No one saw us come home." The forgotten faces of the subway. By 1920, the faces of the Lost Battalion could be found all over New York, not on posters or memorials, but in subway tunnels, on street corners, in flop houses and soup kitchens. Private Michael McAvoy, once a scout, now swept floors at a warehouse on the East River. Sergeant Thomas Sullivan drove a taxi, his hands trembling every time he heard a backfire. Others didn't make it that far. 3 veterans from the unit took their own lives within a year. Their families received letters that read simply, "Cause of death, nervous breakdown." The phrase post-traumatic stress disorder didn't exist yet. They called it shell shock. Doctors called it weak nerves. The nation called it forget it and move on. The weight of survival. Major Charles Whittlesey had become a celebrity, the reluctant hero of the Lost Battalion. He hated the attention. Every banquet, every interview, every question about how it felt to be brave cut him deeper. He once told a reporter, "There was nothing brave about it. We were hungry, scared, and dying. I did what any man would do. I stayed because leaving was impossible." By 1921, the parades had stopped, the speeches had ended, and the people had moved on. But for Whittlesey, the forest never ended. The voyage that never returned. On November 24, 1921, Thanksgiving Day, Whittlesey boarded the steamship SS Toloa, bound for Havana, Cuba. He told friends he needed rest. He had been suffering from sleeplessness, nightmares, and a feeling he described as the suffocating weight of memory. Witnesses later said he died quietly that evening, smoking a cigarette as the ship cut through calm waters. Then, sometime after midnight, he removed his coat, folded it neatly on a chair, and stepped over the rail into the dark Atlantic. His body was never found. A note was discovered in his cabin. It read, "I shall never be able to escape the Argonne." The city that forgot. In the Roaring '20s, America was dancing again. Jazz, prohibition, skyscrapers, the noise of progress drowned the whispers of war. For years, there was no memorial to the Lost Battalion in New York. no official record in city halls or textbooks. The men who survived grew old in silence, carrying medals no one recognized and wounds no one saw. Some gathered in bars every October, the anniversary of the siege, raising glasses not in victory but in remembrance. They would toast, "To the ones who didn't come back, to the ones who never left that ravine." And then they would fall silent. Echoes of the forest. It wasn't until decades later that historians began to rediscover their story. Old letters, fading photos, a few surviving voices on tape. One veteran, interviewed in 1959, said in a trembling voice, "They called us the Lost Battalion, but we were never lost. They were the ones who lost us." His eyes filled with tears. We were left to die, and when we lived, they wanted us to forget. Closing narration. Time moved on. The ravine and the Argonne grew thick with moss and quiet. The trenches eroded, and the world built new wars, new heroes, new memories. But beneath that French soil, somewhere among the rusted helmets and broken rifles, still lies the echo of men who refused to surrender, even when the world surrendered them. It was 1947, nearly 3 decades since the Argonne. The world had just survived another global war. The names of new heroes filled the headlines: Normandy, Midway, Hiroshima. They had been abandoned by history. The old veterans of the Lost Battalion were now middle-aged men, their stories fading into the static of forgotten newsreels. But in a government archive outside Washington, a young military historian stumbled upon a folder marked only with a single code: A77C, restricted. Inside were maps, handwritten notes, and fragments of a classified report, pieces of a truth that had been buried for almost 30 years. Discovery. The historian's name was Harold Benson, a veteran of the Second World War himself, assigned to organize older records for declassification. He wasn't looking for secrets. He was simply trying to clean up old paperwork. But when he opened one envelope, a yellowed field map slipped out, the same Argonne sector where the Lost Battalion had fought. On the corner of the map was written in faded pencil, "Friendly fire confirmed, cease order ignored." Benson froze. He knew instantly what that meant. Someone, decades earlier, had documented the truth that the world was never meant to see: the missing pages. The more he dug, the stranger the trail became. The file, A77, referenced multiple attachments: communications log, artillery orders, casualty chart, but most were missing. Some had been marked destroyed. Others had been relocated to an undisclosed facility. Still, a few scraps survived, enough to form a haunting picture. A telegraph order, half burned, read, "Advance north, enemy in retreat." But someone had scribbled a note beside it: "No confirmation, coordinates unverified." That unverified command had sent Whittlesey and his men straight into the jaws of the German line. The Whisper Network. Benson quietly reached out to older officers who might remember the Argonne file. One, a retired colonel, agreed to meet in a Washington cafe. He spoke softly, glancing around the room. "We all knew it was a mistake," he said. "The orders were never checked. But the brass couldn't afford another scandal after the armistice. The country wanted heroes, not errors." He took a sip of coffee. "They turned a tragedy into a legend. That's how history is written." Suppressed truth. In 1951, Benson submitted a request to publish an academic article titled "Operational Miscommunications in the Argonne 1918." It was rejected. The official response read, "Lacks sufficient evidence and poses potential risk to military morale and historical cohesion." His supervisor quietly advised him to drop it. "Some truths," he said, "don't belong to the living." The veterans speak again. By the mid-1950s, the surviving members of the Lost Battalion were dying off, but a handful were still alive, gray-haired, bent, but sharp in memory. Benson traveled to New York to find them. He met Private Henry Gallagher, one of the runners who had tried to carry messages through enemy lines during the siege. Gallagher's eyes were dim, but his voice was steady. "We begged them to stop shelling us," he said. "We sent pigeons, runners, everything. But they kept firing. They said we were surrounded by Germans. We were surrounded by our own guns." Benson asked him if anyone ever apologized. Gallagher smiled sadly. "They gave us medals instead." A letter never sent. Among Benson's collected materials was an unsigned memo dated 1919. Recommend limited public disclosure. Maintain narrative of heroism. Omit references to artillery error. It was typed on War Department stationery. The author's name was redacted. That one memo confirmed everything. The Lost Battalion had not only been abandoned in battle, Elf himself.
Fading voices. In 1961, Benson published a small independent book titled The Men We Lost Twice. It sold only a few hundred copies, but those who read it recognized it for what it was, the first honest attempt to tell the full story. By the time he died in 1978, most of the original soldiers were gone. Their children barely knew the details. Their grandchildren never heard the name Whittlesey. Yet somewhere, deep in military archives, copies of Benson's book began to circulate. By the late 1980s, it reached a new generation of historians. In 1989, the U.S. Army quietly declassified several Argonne operation reports, including the long-lost Sector C communications log. It contained confirmation. The artillery barrage that killed dozens of American troops had been directed by coordinates sent in error from the 77th Division's own command post. The Lost Battalion had been bombarded not by the enemy, but by the very nation they fought to serve. For 70 years, the truth lay buried beneath layers of pride and paper. But truth, like the forest, always finds a way to grow through the cracks. Today, historians remember the Lost Battalion not as a blunder, not as propaganda, but as a symbol of the human cost of silence. They remind us that history is not only what is written in official reports, it is also what is erased. And in the silence between those erased lines, the Lost Battalion still marches on, ghosts of courage and witnesses to the price of forgotten truth. History is not written only in books. It breathes in films, in parades, in the quiet lines of a veteran's face. Even when official words vanish, the echoes of truth find new voices. By the time the world entered the Cold War, America had changed. It was no longer the same country that sent boys into the Argonne. But somewhere beneath the noise of atomic headlines and political speeches, the story of the Lost Battalion began to whisper again, in unexpected places. After World War II, Hollywood filled theaters with war films, glorious, heroic, patriotic. Yet none mentioned the Lost Battalion. Their story was too dark, too complicated, too honest. In 1948, a low-budget film titled Lost Battalion was produced, based loosely on the Argonne siege. It was meant as a patriotic morale piece. The soldiers in the movie never suffered friendly fire. They never questioned their orders. They were saved by bravery, not confusion. The tagline read, "They fought alone and won for freedom." It was entertainment, not history. But even that small film planted a seed, an unease that there was more to the legend than the script told. The 1960s, the scholars return. The 1960s were years of protest, and young Americans began to question official history. In universities, professors rediscovered Harold Benson's lost book, The Men We Lost Twice. It spread quietly among students. One veteran-turned-teacher, Dr. Leonard Kessler, used it in his lectures on war memory. He said to his class,
The Lost Battalion was not just trapped by Germans. They were trapped by their own nation's need for heroes. Students listened in silence. For the first time in decades, the story was not told with trumpets and medals, but with grief and truth. The 1970s, the new voices. In 1977, the Public Broadcasting Service, PBS, aired a documentary titled Forgotten Soldiers. It included newly discovered interviews from the last surviving veterans of the 77th Division. One of them, Corporal Sam Friedman, spoke through trembling lips. "We didn't feel like heroes. We felt like ghosts that someone kept erasing." That one line struck millions. The documentary won no major awards, but it ignited something larger, a movement among historians to demand access to still classified war archives. Within 5 years, those sealed Argonne files began to open. By the late 1980s, the U.S. Army's Historical Division confirmed the friendly fire evidence. Newspapers began to revisit the old story.
Headlines read, "The Battalion America Forgot. Truth at Last, the Argonne Re-Examined." For the first time, the soldiers' descendants learned what had truly happened. Letters poured in from families, sons, daughters, grandchildren, all saying the same thing. Now we understand what our fathers never spoke about. Across the Atlantic, the French government built a small memorial in the exact ravine where Whittlesey's men had held their ground. It read simply, "À ceux qui ne se sont jamais rendus," to those who never surrendered. The 1990s, the film that spoke the truth. In 2001, HBO produced a new film titled The Lost Battalion. This time, the truth was not hidden. The friendly fire, the confusion, the psychological torment, all were portrayed without censorship. It shocked audiences. Critics called it one of the most honest depictions of war ever made. For the first time in mainstream media, Whittlesey was not a clean-cut hero, but a haunted man crushed by silence and responsibility. That film reached millions, and for a brief moment, the ghosts of the Argonne spoke again. The 2000s, history reborn online. As the internet grew, amateur historians and descendants began creating online archives. Websites, forums, and blogs emerged dedicated to preserving the full record of the Lost Battalion. They shared scanned documents, letters, and photographs. In digital spaces, truth could no longer be buried. One descendant of Private Gallagher wrote, "They were lost in 1918. We found them again in 2008 online." The modern era, memory and meaning. Today, the story of the Lost Battalion is taught in military academies and ethics classes as a case study in miscommunication, leadership, and moral courage. It has become a parable, a reminder that heroism is not always victory, and obedience is not always loyalty. Historians now say, they were lost not because they failed, but because they were faithful. Their story challenges every generation to ask what we are willing to forget in the name of national pride. Closing narration. In the Argonne Forest today, birds nest in trees grown from the same soil where Whittlesey's men once bled. The ravine is quiet now. Only a small stone marker remains. Tourists pass by without knowing that beneath their feet lie the bones of men who changed the meaning of the word lost. They were not lost in direction. They were lost to history, and history at last found them again. The forest was silent. The mud clung to every boot, every uniform, every exhausted body. The wind whispered through the broken trees as if it carried the voices of men who had no one left to hear them. And in that silence, the soldiers wrote. Letters, journals, scraps of paper, a desperate attempt to leave a trace of life. Some were never mailed.
Some were buried under rocks. Some survived, decades later in dusty archives. These words, written in fear and hope, reveal what no headline or medal could ever capture. Private Michael McCavey, September 29, 1918. I have never been so hungry in my life. The rations are gone, the water is muddy, and yet we hold. I pray that someone finds us. I think of my mother and the sandwiches she used to pack. I try not to cry, but my eyes sting constantly. Corporal Sam Friedman, October 2nd. We keep moving from shell hole to shell hole. Some of the men are blind from gas, others barely conscious. I don't know if the officers know where we are. We are forgotten. I can feel it in my bones. If we die here, may someone write that we fought. Private Henry Gallagher, October 4th. I ran through the forest today to deliver a message. Bullets whizzed past my ears. I tripped, I fell, I prayed. I prayed harder than I ever have in my life. The men here are brave, but we are all so afraid. God, let us live. Lieutenant James Lick, October 5th. I feel the weight of every life in my hands. Every order I give could be the difference between life and death. I try to remain calm, to be strong, but inside I am screaming. We are surrounded, yes, but more than that, we are alone. Private William Kessler, October 7th. Today I held my friend as he died. I told him help was coming. I lied. I cannot forgive myself for lying. The forest eats man, not bullets. We are slowly disappearing, one by one. The letters that never reached home. Thousands of words were written on scraps of paper, torn notebooks, and even envelopes. Some were thrown over the lines in hopes of reaching command. Some were tucked into the folds of uniforms and buried. Only a few letters made it to families. Most were found decades later, faded, unread, and fragile. Each letter revealed the humanity of these soldiers, their fear, their humor, their longing for home. One surviving envelope read, "Tell my mother I fought as hard as I could. Tell my brother to be kinder to his friends. And tell everyone we were not afraid of them. We were afraid we would be forgotten." The Diary of Private Thomas Sullivan, October 8th. Morning, no rations. Afternoon, rain, cold. Evening, the forest is quiet, except for moans. Night, I write to keep my mind from leaving me. We are alive, barely, but alive. If tomorrow comes, may it be enough. Major Charles Whittlesey, final entry, October 9th. We are trapped. Every man I see is a brother, a hero. We have endured beyond reason. I don't know if rescue will come, but I will remain here until my last breath. If I die, let it be known that every man here gave everything he had. The weight of words. These letters and diary entries were never meant for fame or medals. They were cries for recognition, proof of existence.
And please to remember the men behind the numbers. Every note carried courage, sorrow, and humanity. They revealed the true cost of war, not in strategy or politics, but in the lives of ordinary men facing extraordinary circumstances. Rediscovery. Decades later, historians pieced together these letters, connecting them to the names in official records. Families finally knew the fate of their sons, brothers, and fathers. The words became bridges across time, from the haunted Argonne Forest to New York, from the buried soldiers to a nation that had almost forgotten them. Closing narration. The forest may have swallowed the men physically, but their words refused to die. Through ink, paper, and memory, the Lost Battalion speaks, not only of war, but of love, fear, and resilience. They remind us that even in the darkest trenches, humanity can endure. And though bullets fade and battles are forgotten, letters remain. They carry the voices of those who would otherwise be lost. October 8, 1918. The forest of Argonne was thick with mist, mud, and the smell of gunpowder. The men of the 77th Division had held their ground for nearly a week, cut off from reinforcements, surrounded by enemy fire, and haunted by the shells of their own artillery. Every second was a battle, every breath a miracle. The survivors speak. Private Michael McCaffrey later recalled, "We were pinned down, but we never stopped moving. Every man had to drag himself forward over the dead and dying. The forest became a nightmare we could not wake from." Corporal Sam Friedman described the chaos. "We shouted messages to each other, but the smoke and noise swallowed every word. I thought I would never see another sunrise." Major Whittlesey's leadership. Despite exhaustion, Major Charles Whittlesey refused to surrender. He moved along the line, distributing the last supplies, calming terrified men, and making impossible decisions. "Stay in the ravine," he told his officers. "Every inch of ground we hold is a promise, to each other, to those who sent us, to our country." Whittlesey carried with him a small notebook, writing coordinates, casualty counts, and orders, a final record of a battalion teetering on the edge of annihilation. The desperate attempts to communicate. The battalion's runners risked their lives daily to reach the command post. Pigeons were released into the foggy sky, messages tied to their legs, hoping for a miracle. Some never made it. Others returned, missing fingers or bleeding from shrapnel wounds. Private Gallagher remembered, "I ran for hours, bullets singing past my ears. Every time I fell, I thought, maybe this is it. But somehow, I kept going. For the men, for Major Whittlesey." The rescue begins. On October 8th, late afternoon, relief forces finally broke through the German lines. Lieutenant Colonel George B. McIntyre led a unit to the ravine, fighting through mines, machine guns, and collapsing trenches. He later wrote in his report, "We expected to find a few survivors. What we found was an entire battalion, ragged, starving, yet defiant. Their courage had kept them alive against impossible odds." Reuniting the battalion. The survivors were carried from the mud and forest floor, many unable to walk. Sergeant Thomas Sullivan recounted, "I looked around and saw my men, some missing limbs, some pale as ghosts. And yet there was a fire in their eyes. We had survived, together." Major Whittlesey, exhausted beyond belief, simply whispered, "It is done. We are not lost." The aftermath of rescue. The battalion was transported to field hospitals. Doctors were astonished at how few had succumbed to illness and injury, given the conditions. Families who had feared the worst were reunited with sons, brothers, and husbands. Yet, even in triumph, a shadow remained. The psychological scars, the guilt of the lost, and the knowledge of friendly fire haunted every step. Eyewitness reflection. Private William Kessler reflected decades later, "We were carried out, yes, but the forest stayed with us. The cries of men, the silence of the fallen, it never left our minds. That was the price of surviving." Honors and recognition. And please to remember the men behind the numbers. Every note carried courage, sorrow, and humanity. They revealed the true cost of war, not in strategy or politics, but in the lives of ordinary men facing extraordinary circumstances. Rediscovery. Decades later, historians pieced together these letters, connecting them to the names in official records. Families finally knew the fate of their sons, brothers, and fathers. The words became bridges across time, from the haunted Argonne Forest to New York, from the buried soldiers to a nation that had almost forgotten them. Closing narration. The forest may have swallowed the men physically, but their words refused to die. Through ink, paper, and memory, the Lost Battalion speaks, not only of war, but of love, fear, and resilience. They remind us that even in the darkest trenches, humanity can endure. And though bullets fade and battles are forgotten, letters remain. They carry the voices of those who would otherwise be lost. October 8, 1918. The forest of Argonne was thick with mist, mud, and the smell of gunpowder. The men of the 77th Division had held their ground for nearly a week, cut off from reinforcements, surrounded by enemy fire, and haunted by the shells of their own artillery. Every second was a battle, every breath a miracle. The survivors speak. Private Michael McCaffrey later recalled, "We were pinned down, but we never stopped moving. Every man had to drag himself forward over the dead and dying. The forest became a nightmare we could not wake from." Corporal Sam Friedman described the chaos. "We shouted messages to each other, but the smoke and noise swallowed every word. I thought I would never see another sunrise." Major Whittlesey's leadership. Despite exhaustion, Major Charles Whittlesey refused to surrender. He moved along the line, distributing the last supplies, calming terrified men, and making impossible decisions. "Stay in the ravine," he told his officers. "Every inch of ground we hold is a promise, to each other, to those who sent us, to our country." Whittlesey carried with him a small notebook, writing coordinates, casualty counts, and orders, a final record of a battalion teetering on the edge of annihilation. The desperate attempts to communicate. The battalion's runners risked their lives daily to reach the command post. Pigeons were released into the foggy sky, messages tied to their legs, hoping for a miracle. Some never made it. Others returned, missing fingers or bleeding from shrapnel wounds. Private Gallagher remembered, "I ran for hours, bullets singing past my ears. Every time I fell, I thought, maybe this is it. But somehow, I kept going. For the men, for Major Whittlesey." The rescue begins. On October 8th, late afternoon, relief forces finally broke through the German lines. Lieutenant Colonel George B. McIntyre led a unit to the ravine, fighting through mines, machine guns, and collapsing trenches. He later wrote in his report, "We expected to find a few survivors. What we found was an entire battalion, ragged, starving, yet defiant. Their courage had kept them alive against impossible odds, reuniting the battalion." The survivors were carried from the mud and forest floor, many unable to walk. Sergeant Thomas Sullivan recounted, "I looked around and saw my men, some missing limbs, some pale as ghosts, and yet there was a fire in their eyes. We had survived, together." Major Whittlesey, exhausted beyond belief, simply whispered, "It is done. We are not lost." The aftermath of rescue. The battalion was transported to field hospitals. Doctors were astonished at how few had succumbed to illness and injury, given the conditions. Families who had feared the worst were reunited with sons, brothers, and husbands. Yet, even in triumph, a shadow remained. The psychological scars, the guilt of the lost, and the knowledge of friendly fire haunted every step. Eyewitness reflection. Private William Kessler reflected decades later, "We were carried out, yes, but the forest stayed with us. The cries of men, the silence of the fallen, it never left our minds. That was the price of surviving." Honors and recognition. Major Whittlesey was awarded the Medal of Honor, and the battalion received official recognition for extraordinary bravery. Yet, as history would reveal in the following decades, the glory could not erase the pain. The official records painted a picture of heroism, but buried within them were the truths that had been hidden, the mistakes that had almost destroyed them. The Lost Battalion had held the line. Against exhaustion, starvation, and misdirected artillery, they endured. The Argonne Forest had tested every ounce of courage and will.
And while the medals and reports could honor the outward story, the real testament remained in the hearts of the men, in letters, diaries, and memories that no one could erase. They were found, yes, but they were never truly the same. And that is the essence of the Lost Battalion. Not only a story of survival, but of resilience, of humanity, and of a courage that defied even the negligence of their own command. The battalion had been rescued. The war had ended. The medals were awarded. And then, silence. The story of the Lost Battalion faded into the shadows of history. New wars, new headlines, new heroes. The world moved on, and so did the memory of the men who had been trapped in the Argonne. The forgotten survivors. For the surviving soldiers, life was a struggle. They returned to jobs, families, and cities that barely remembered their sacrifice. Most never spoke of the forest, the mud, or the friendly fire that had nearly killed them. Private McAvoy became a warehouse foreman. Sergeant Sullivan ran a taxi service. Major Whittlesey, after his brief celebrity, had vanished into despair, a haunting shadow of the hero the nation believed him to be. The public narrative was simple. They fought bravely, they were rescued, they became heroes. The complexities, the horrors, the mistakes, those details were hidden away in sealed files. The archives remained silent. The War Department locked away thousands of pages of reports, maps, and letters. For decades, the Argonne operations were summarized in sanitized paragraphs. The 77th Division held its ground under challenging conditions. Bureaucratic language replaced human experience. Historians who requested access were often denied. The battalion existed officially, but its full story did not. Rediscovery begins. In the 1960s and 1970s, a small group of military historians began combing through old records. Harold Benson's book, The Men We Lost Twice, became a quiet reference. Researchers discovered that scattered letters, diaries, and photographs had been preserved by families and collectors. Slowly, a patchwork story emerged. The friendly fire, the starvation, the heroism under impossible circumstances. The Lost Battalion was no longer a vague legend. It was real, flawed, human, and unforgettable. Family efforts. Descendants of the men began writing to each other, compiling letters and stories. One granddaughter of Private Gallagher said, "We were piecing together a story no one had ever fully told. It was like finding a family that had been hidden from history." These family efforts were crucial in bringing the battalion's story back into public memory. Media and public interest. By the 1980s, small articles began appearing in newspapers, detailing survivor accounts and the Argonne's tragic details. PBS aired Forgotten Soldiers in 1977, bringing renewed attention to the subject. HBO's 2001 adaptation made the story widely known, introducing millions of viewers to the true experience of the Lost Battalion. Finally, after nearly 80 years, the world began to understand the cost, the courage, and the injustice. The historical record restored. In 1989, official military declassifications included the communication logs and maps that proved friendly fire. The Lost Battalion story could now be told fully. The mistakes, the bravery, the agony, and the resilience. Historians praise the rediscovery. It is a story of endurance and the human cost of war, a story that was almost lost to bureaucracy and time. Decades of silence had nearly buried the truth, but letters, diaries, photographs, and the perseverance of families ensured that the men of the Lost Battalion were remembered. History may hide its mistakes, but the echoes of courage cannot be erased. And as historians, descendants, and storytellers piece together the fragments, the Lost Battalion marches again, through memory, through narrative, through the enduring spirit of those who refuse to surrender. History is a teacher. Sometimes it teaches in textbooks, sometimes it teaches in silence. The story of the Lost Battalion became a lesson not just of courage, but of leadership, ethics, and accountability. What happened in the Argonne Forest in 1918 continues to influence military thought, public memory, and cultural understanding of war.
Lessons in leadership and ethics. Major Charles Whittlesey's leadership is studied to this day. His calm under fire, his insistence on holding ground to protect soldiers' lives, his courage in making impossible decisions. Military academies now teach the Lost Battalion as a case study. Leadership is measured not only by victory, but by moral courage in impossible situations. But the battalion also serves as a warning. Miscommunication, bureaucracy, and political pressure can cost lives as surely as enemy bullets. The friendly fire incident in particular is cited in modern military ethics courses as an example of why clear communication and accountability are critical. Cultural memory. Over the decades, the Lost Battalion has been represented in books, documentaries, and films. Unlike sanitized war stories, their experience emphasizes the human cost of blind obedience, the resilience of ordinary soldiers under extreme conditions, the importance of remembering mistakes, not just victories. These stories challenge the public to rethink war, not as glory, but as a complex human struggle with tragedy and heroism intertwined. Honoring the forgotten. Memorials in the Argonne Forest and New York City now honor the battalion. Descendants continue to preserve letters, diaries, and photographs. Military historians publish new findings regularly, ensuring the battalion's story remains alive. A quote from historian Dr. Leonard Kessler: "The Lost Battalion teaches us that heroes are not flawless. They are human, and their humanity is what makes their courage remarkable." Modern military practice. The lessons from Argonne influenced military policies, improved communication protocols, better battlefield coordination, emphasis on psychological health and post-combat care. Modern students study the Argonne as a reminder that survival is not just physical, it is ethical, emotional, and organizational. Public memory and recognition. In schools, museums, and online archives, the Lost Battalion is no longer forgotten. Documentaries, exhibitions, and scholarly research make the battalion accessible to new generations. Their story challenges us to remember not only the victories, but the costs of mistakes, silence, and neglect. It is a call to honor courage without erasing truth. Closing narration. The men of the Lost Battalion held the line in 1918. They survived the forest, the bullets, and the abandonment. Yet history nearly forgot them. Today, we remember, we study them, we honor them. Their legacy endures in ethics classes, in memorials, in films, and in every whisper of wind through the Argonne Forest. They remind us, courage is timeless. Sacrifice is eternal, and truth, no matter how buried, will eventually rise. War often honors units, medals, and victories, but history sometimes forgets the men behind the uniform. In the Argonne Forest, heroism took many forms, not all recorded in reports or speeches. Here are the untold stories of those who made impossible choices. Private Michael McCavier, the Scout. McCavier had been a boy from the Lower East Side of New York. Small, fast, and fearless, he volunteered as a scout. During the siege, he ran alone through enemy lines to deliver a message for reinforcements. "I thought every step could be my last," he recalled later. "I heard bullets crack like whips behind me, but I kept running. Every man back in the ravine counted on me. I couldn't fail them." His courage saved dozens of lives by allowing command to adjust artillery and supplies. Corporal Sam Friedman, the medic. Friedman was assigned as a medic, but there were barely any medical supplies. He improvised bandages from torn uniforms and water from mud puddles. "I stayed with the wounded all day, all night. Some men begged me to leave them, but I couldn't. I knew I could not save them all, but I had to try." He earned the respect of every soldier,
not with medals, but with quiet acts of bravery. Sergeant Thomas Sullivan, the messenger. Sullivan carried messages repeatedly through shell fire and dense fog. At one point, he was struck by shrapnel in the arm and leg. He refused evacuation, insisting, "The men need to know what's coming. If I can crawl, I can run. If I fall, someone else will carry it." He survived, and the battalion later credited his determination with keeping communication lines open. Private Henry Gallagher, the lookout. Gallagher volunteered to watch the tree line for enemy movement, a task that meant sitting still under sniper fire for hours. "I couldn't move, couldn't blink too long. Every second I moved was a chance to die. But I could see the Germans coming before anyone else, and that saved lives." Gallagher became known as the Silent Sentinel, a man whose quiet vigilance kept the battalion alive. Major Charles Whittlesey, the reluctant hero. Though everyone knows Whittlesey as the leader, his heroism was more personal than public. He gave away the last of his food to a young soldier who had gone days without. He walked through sniper fire to encourage the terrified and exhausted. He spent hours in the mud, documenting positions and writing letters to families, even while barely eating himself. "I did what I had to do," he later said. "I am no hero. I just couldn't let them die." The acts that went unseen. Not all acts were documented. Soldiers covered one another in mud to hide from snipers. They shared the last drops of water and bread. Some gave their life jackets, boots, or coats to others who had none. Every soldier became a hero in some way. Their courage amplified not by medals, but by small sacrifices that ensured others survived. Legacy of personal courage. These stories remind us that heroism is rarely singular. It is a mosaic of bravery, determination, and sacrifice. The Lost Battalion's survival depended not only on leadership, but on countless small acts of courage, each one unrecorded, each one essential.
Closing narration. In war, the spotlight often shines on the commander, but in the trenches of Argonne, the light shone in every soldier who refused to give up, every man who protected a brother, every quiet hero whose name may never appear on the plaque. History remembers the battalion, but courage remembers the individuals. And in those frozen days of 1918, the Lost Battalion was made not of legends, but of men. War leaves scars on the battlefield, but it also leaves invisible wounds at home. Families waited, worried, and sometimes never received news of their loved ones. For the Lost Battalion, those home front stories became a quiet testament to survival. Waiting for letters. Mrs. McAvoy, Michael's mother, checked the mailbox every day. Even if it was just a scrap of paper, I needed to know he was alive. For weeks, letters never arrived. When Michael finally returned, she realized she had clutched empty envelopes more tightly than life itself. Similarly, families of soldiers like Thomas Sullivan spent months believing the worst. The uncertainty became part of their daily lives, a shadow that lingered long after the battalion was rescued. Preserving the letters and diaries. Many of the letters written in the Argonne never reached their destinations. Families who recovered them decades later treated these letters as sacred artifacts. Henry Gallagher's descendants kept his letters tucked in a cedar chest, reading and rereading them quietly so they could understand the man he had been. "It's like he's speaking to me," said his granddaughter. "I can hear the fear, the hope, the courage. I can feel what he felt even a century later." These letters became bridges across generations, connecting the present to the battlefield of 1918. Oral histories and family stories. Many stories were passed down orally. Families remembered small details. Michael McAvoy humming a tune while running messages. Sullivan sharing his last piece of bread with a younger soldier. Gallagher quietly watching the forest for danger. These oral accounts preserved not only the facts, but the humanity